You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome, friends, to the kind of episode that reminds me why I podcast more than I preach. This week's topics are the kind of things that would get you uninvited from preaching at a church. And what are those topics, you ask? Well, it is Exodus chapter 11 and the first part of chapter 12. Chapter 11 is pretty short. Chapter 12 is super long. So we are going to go roughly about 10, 11 verses into chapter 12 after covering chapter 11. We have the final sign of the 10 signs of the Exodus, the death of the firstborn. We have the institution of Passover. And we have some really tough questions like God's willingness to kill innocent babies. We are also going to deal with why the Israelites basically looted their Egyptian neighbors. And yes, we are going to even bring that conversation into today with discussion of reparations and modern slavery. So, like I said, this is the kind of thing that would get you not invited back ever again and possibly church disciplined. So it's going to be a fun episode. Let's get into it. Going to start us off just reading chapter 11. It is literally only 10 verses long, so this will not take long for us to get through this part. Well, I say that, and then those of you who have listened for a while, you're probably already rolling your eyes because you know I can take a 10-verse chapter and make a full podcast out of it. So let's see what we've got here. Yahweh said to Moses, "Yet will I bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he'll let you go from here. When he will let you go, he will surely thrust you out hence altogether. So speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow from his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold." And Yahweh gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. And Moses said, "Thus says Yahweh, about midnight I will go in the middle of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. And there will be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against the children of Israel will not even a dog move his tongue, against man or beast, that you may know that Yahweh puts a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants will come to me, and they'll bow down themselves to me, saying, 'Get you out, all the people that follow you, and after that I will go out.' And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. And Yahweh said to Moses, 'Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt.' And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of his land." Now, before we even get into the content of these chapters, we have to address a narrative problem here that you may have picked up on if you were listening to last week's episode. At the end of chapter 10, what we covered last week, we have a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh that gets really heated to the point that Pharaoh says, "Leave here. If you ever see my face again, you're going to die." And Moses is like, "Sure thing, pal. You're never going to see me again." Very dramatic, very final. But then this chapter, chapter 11, is still dialogue between Moses and Pharaoh. Chapter 8 makes this very clear because Moses is speaking directly to Pharaoh when he says, "These your servants will come to me and bow down themselves to me, saying, 'Get you out and all the people that follow after you.'" So chapter 10 seems to be the end of their dialogue, but then chapter 11 includes more dialogue with them. So Robert Alter suggests that the speech to Pharaoh in verses 4 through 8 of this chapter is actually the continuation and the conclusion of the angry confrontation from the previous chapter. He says that God's words to Moses in verses 1 through 3 don't seem very smoothly integrated into the narrative process, at any rate not according to modern expectations of narrative continuity. So the way that I see this is it's kind of like when you're watching a movie and they show you some action scene at the very beginning, and then you have this God voice from above that says something like, all right, let's see how all this actually happened. And then they go back, tell you the whole story, and sometime in the third act of the movie, it catches up to the very first scene. Yeah, that kind of non-linear storytelling. That's something that the Bible sometimes plays with as well. It's not just a modern thing. Abraham Ibn Ezra, a medieval Jewish commentator, points out that a lot of this is actually a restatement in these several verses here of God's predictions to Moses way back in the burning bush episode. And scholar Umberto Cassuto sees it as kind of a flashback in Moses' mind, a summarizing recapitulation of God's initial promise to confound Egypt and liberate Israel. So, right off the bat here, we are dealing with a text that is more concerned with theological meaning than with chronological precision. So keep that in mind as we dive deeper. And we need to talk about a couple word choices here, because the word for plague in verse 1 is actually different from what we've seen from words that have been used to describe any of the previous 9 plagues. In fact, this particular word has only been used one other time in the entirety of the Torah, back in Genesis 12:17, when God plagued Pharaoh's predecessor by several generations for unknowingly taking Abram's wife Sarai into his harem. So it's this weird word that kind of has the idea of a violent infestation in its most literal form. It actually gets used a lot in Leviticus for skin diseases. So I find it kind of weird that the authors chose to use that word here to describe the death of the firstborn when we had signs previously that actually were skin diseases. So I'm not quite sure why they chose this word at this time, but I thought that was worth pointing out. I'll also note that if you're using an older version like the King James and you see something like surely show up in the Tanakh, it is almost always the same word side by side in Hebrew. So that happens here in verse 1 when we have God saying to Moses that Pharaoh will surely thrust you out. It is the same word in Hebrew, just in 2 different forms side by side. So kind of like thrusting out, he will thrust you out, or kicking you out, he'll kick you out. But because that's not great English, a lot of times the translators just add in an adverb to add more force to the verb. So that's why he'll surely thrust you out, or he'll indeed thrust you out, something along those lines. The next word we have to talk about is one that is going to start getting me in trouble here already, just 5 minutes into this. So that is the word borrow here in verse 2. Speak now in the ears of the people, have every man borrow of his neighbor, every woman of her neighbor. That's a pretty poor word choice, because there was no intention of giving it back. That's like asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Like, I am not giving you back the sugar once I've used it, right? The Hebrew word behind it actually means to claim or demand something. So the Israelites are essentially going to their Egyptian neighbors and saying, give us your valuables. And the only reason they were in a position to make these demands was because the Egyptians were terrified of them after witnessing these 9, now coming on 10, increasingly devastating plagues. And I want to pause here for a minute and actually think through the ramifications of this. This is not a part of the story that gets highlighted as frequently when we're telling the Exodus account. It's a little awkward. Like, why did this have to happen? Surely not every one of these Egyptians worked as taskmasters over the Israelites. They weren't as evil as Pharaoh. I think we can get behind the judgment on Pharaoh, maybe even okay with some of the Egyptians, like the bureaucracy, suffering from some of the plagues, or maybe even the people in general, if you want to say they went along with it and they didn't do anything to help the Israelites who were enslaved. Different culture, I don't even think they would have considered that much of a problem back then, because a lot of people were slaves at some point in their lifetime. It was just the way the world worked. But why did the Israelites have to add insult to injury and, by God's command, loot people who had nothing to do with their enslavement? I mean, the average Egyptian couldn't just go up to Pharaoh and say, hey, I have a moral problem with this, and I really don't think you should be keeping these people in slavery. Like, that would just get them probably enslaved as well, if not beaten and killed. So why would God tell them to do this? Literarily, we can look at the story and say, well, if we go ahead several chapters, it's going to be so that they can have the gold and silver in order to build the tabernacle, and that's going to get misused with the golden calf incident as well. And I know some people would probably say, well, God is God, and anything he says to do is right. But does this feel right to you? They are bullying average everyday Egyptians into giving them valuables. It's not even like they were demanding food or clothing. I would be totally okay with that. But this is also valuables, family heirlooms probably, priceless jewelry. Why was this okay? These Egyptians were not direct abusers of Israel, but they were neighbors. And see, that word for neighbors is actually the same word that gets used of friends, implying that they lived close together. Not that long ago in human history, you were expected to be relatively friendly with the people who lived near you. And it's really only been the last 100 years, as we have the invention of air conditioning and much more comfortable houses, that we have isolated ourselves from the people who live nearest to us. So there's this assumption in the ancient Near Eastern mindset that the people near you are going to look out for you. They are going to be your friends. These Egyptians, while maybe they didn't have the political power to make a difference, they still saw the plight of these Israelites every day, and they did nothing about it. They were passive onlookers to the daily abuse of the Israelites. So let's get controversial for a second. What does that say about those of us who are aware of harmful practices and habits that friends or maybe even fellow church members may have, and we refuse to speak up out of fear? What does that say about the person who knows that there's domestic abuse or spiritual abuse or even sexual abuse going on in a situation and they don't say anything? This passage really makes it sound like God's policy is see something, say something. You may not be a direct perpetrator of wrongdoing, but there's kind of that overused phrase, silence is violence. In a way, being silent about something that you know is going on that is wrong is allowing that wrong to go on. I saw this happen so much in church, where in the church that I grew up in, we had multiple staff members in one position leave just over and over again. It was like a revolving door for this particular position, and we never got a clear answer of why, because it was this culture of silence that said the quote-unquote unity of the church was more important than the truth. We don't want people to actually know what's going on behind the scenes because that's messy. So we'd rather just present this unified front and act as if nothing is going on. Well, there was spiritual abuse that was going on. Sexism, misogyny, yelling at people, gaslighting, all of this stuff. And because no one was willing to speak up about it, because they had been beaten down and told you obey the spiritual authority, the pastor over you who's telling you to do this, then that allowed that abuse to continue. Silence allowed the violence to continue. Those innocent people who had been hurt and who left because of that hurt also in that way became part of the problem because the system had beat them down and told them, shut up and just go along with the narrative. And they allowed that to continue. That's why when we ended up having to leave, we made sure we were honest about it with people. And that kind of got me kicked out even a little bit faster because people did not like that at all. But, in the immortal words of the Cranberries, when the violence causes silence, who are we mistaken? But you see, it's not me. It's not my family. And that's, as many of you know, from the song Zombie. And that's kind of just the way that mindset takes over, is it turns you into this zombie that sees abuse happen, that sees people getting mistreated. We see this even in the political climate today here in America, as we see people around us being mistreated, but as long as it's not me, as long as it's not my tribe, I'm just going to shut up because it's not affecting me. Well, eventually it does affect you. This was something we talked about with the hordes in our episode on contamination and disgust theology. Is this theology of disgust, this mindset of disgust, it has to have a scapegoat, it has to have an enemy. And whenever that enemy gets taken care of, shall we say, in the most mob boss way possible, then we need some other scapegoat, because a community that scapegoats can't exist without the scapegoat. It is built around having some shared enemy. So the lines around this group start getting narrower and narrower. The boundaries start shrinking because we need someone else to blame, and it will eventually get back to you. I know that's uncomfortable, but the Bible is a book of liberation. Exodus is a story of liberation, and liberation is going to hurt the people who have hurt other people. Like, we would not need liberation if people were not being hurt. And if you find that this message of liberation is uncomfortable to you, that means that you are much closer to the side of Pharaoh and the Egyptians in the story than you are to Moses and the Israelites. And honestly, so am I. If that doesn't make you uncomfortable enough, let's talk about reparations for a minute here.
Ooh, reparations. I wonder what this is about.
Now, if you could not tell by my voice, I'm a white guy, all right? So I do not have a ton of clout for talking about race relations and the abuses that have gone along with it in America. But I can't help but see a parallel when I read this passage. Okay, when I first came up with these notes, it was for a Sunday school series that I was teaching in a church a few years back. And I did not want to come to this conclusion. Okay, again, white guy. Like, I benefit nothing from talking about reparations and slavery and race and crappy things that white people have done in the past. And I realize that none of us listening to this have probably ever owned a slave. However, there is a topic that gets bounced back and forth in politics occasionally of reparations. And I'm just going to keep this on the American side because I'm American. This is what I know more so. So I realize this conversation can certainly take place outside of America as well. But the general idea is, do white people today owe anything to black people today because of the way that our country has treated them in the past? And there's all kind of nuances to this of like, are we talking about white people in general? Are we talking about white people who came from a slave-owning family? Like, there's different degrees that this conversation can take. And this is also a little bit different from the Exodus story because we are roughly 150-ish years post-slavery, while this particular passage is happening right at the very end of Israelite slavery. But we are much closer to segregation. That is, in fact, within the lifetimes of some people possibly even listening to this today. So again, I am not trying to just bring up liberal talking points here. You know, I try to avoid having any major agenda one way or the other with the podcast. I am just looking at this passage and saying there are slaves, they get freed, and God tells them, take things from the people who oppressed you, even if they were not directly the ones who oppressed you. If that does not sound like something that can speak into this conversation, nothing will. And for some people, they probably want nothing to speak into this conversation. I know it would make me more comfortable if I didn't have to have this conversation, if you couldn't tell by how much I'm spinning around in my words right now. It's awkward. But as I look at this passage, and the more I've studied it in the past few years, it really seems to me that according to our sacred Christian scriptures, freedom alone isn't enough. It seems like what God is getting across in our inspired Bible is that those who have benefited from the abuse of others, the Egyptians in this case, are supposed to set up those who have been affected by abuse for future success, the Israelites in this case. You can give a slave freedom, and they're not going to know what to do with that. If they've lived their entire life enslaved to someone else, they are not going to know what to make of having no master. You can free an abused wife from a bad marriage. But if you don't have somebody skilled and trained walking with her through what happened, there is a higher likelihood that she could end up with an abusive partner again. You can free a trafficked teenager, but if you don't help them heal from that, there is a higher likelihood that they could fall back into something like that that offers that same sense of security. See, our job is not just to free people, it is to set them up for success. Churches are really good at telling you what to do so that you personally are not a slave to sin. But they are not very good at giving you practical advice on how to live a good life after that. That's why people leave churches after a while, because it's just a 101 course. All they care about is getting people into heaven, out of hell, get your fire escape, and now start serving in the church. There's not a lot of depth to the biblical teaching because they think the whole narrative is just about escaping hell, when actually that is not the focus of the majority of the Bible. Like, it's certainly a core message, but the majority of Scripture is actually about practical advice on how to live a good life after that. The Bible is a wisdom book about how to live God's portrayal of the best life possible. We can't just stop at giving people a fire escape. We need to broaden our message into practical matters afterward as well. Look, I realize in just a few minutes of talking about this here, I am not going to settle any conversations that have been going on for quite a long time. And I'm not looking to force you to take one particular side on any given topic here. but I do want to make you a little bit uncomfortable. And given how uncomfortable I feel talking about this, I can't help but assume that you probably feel a little uncomfortable as you are mulling over this as well. That's what the Bible is good at. If you read the Bible and you just constantly feel affirmation, or even just, what's the Christian terminology for it? Challenged by this, I don't think that's enough. I think the Bible is meant to make us have that unease feeling in our stomachs, because more often than not, here in this modern world, we are on the side of empire. We are closer to Pharaoh than we are to Moses. And just looking at these passages, I cannot help but think that the message that God is getting across in our inspired sacred scriptures is that freedom isn't enough. We are meant to set up people for success, and particularly those who have benefited in any way from the abuse of others are meant by God to set up those who have been affected by abuse for future success. I know that's a difficult conversation to have, but I don't see a lot of churches having that conversation at all. So I would love to hear from you and just keep this conversation going. You can do that in our Discord and our social feed. Discord would probably be better. We don't necessarily want to start up a conversation about slavery on our social feed. Social media is not the best avenue for that. But I would actually like to talk about this more with people and just hear some thoughts and input on it, regardless of where you're coming from on that. Because I think that the only way that we can move forward and improve for the next generation is if we are having honest discussion and dialogue, even when we don't always agree. All right, for the two of you left listening that I haven't totally lost yet, that is not good podcasting right there, to just front load the first 15 minutes with all of the controversy. Well, maybe not all of the controversy. We always find a way to keep things spicy around here. Let's look at verse 3. The text reads that God gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And to find favor in the sight of someone in Scripture usually means to have a sense of charm or grace that someone finds attractive. But here, the Egyptians find attractive the chance to remove the Israelites from the land. And there's a description here, a moniker used of Moses that is just weird. I don't know if this stood out to you when I read the verse, but it's kind of clunky English. It says, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt. The man Moses? We don't usually talk about people that way. You don't say, the man Colin hosted the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered podcast. Especially if you were speaking directly to me, as it seems like God has been speaking directly to Moses here. So Alter says that this is free indirect discourse. So scholars don't really know exactly why that terminology was used here. There's a couple different theories. Some think maybe it's just to remind us that Moses was, after all, just a man. He wasn't superhuman. I tend to think maybe it's to link him to humanity in general. Whatever path you take with it, it is a very humanizing moment in a narrative that is about to get very divine very quickly. And this is where we add yet more theological intensity into the narrative, because God says that he is going to go into the midst of Egypt around midnight. But notice that in this verse, this is verse 4 that we are in, God doesn't actually say that he will be the one to kill the firstborn. That distinction is going to become very important as we continue this discussion. So keep that in the back of your mind. According to verse 4 of chapter 11, God is going to go out into the midst of Egypt, and then verse 5 says, all the firstborn in the land of Egypt will die. It does not say, I will kill all of the firstborn in the land of Egypt. All right, so keep that in mind. The language used here makes it sound like Yahweh himself is going to go visit Egypt in person, that he wasn't going to judge them from the heavens. He's actually going to walk through the streets of Egypt for a personal inspection. The pattern we see in Scripture is that when God's Spirit presence enters a place that isn't prepared for the appearance of a divine being, people die. Now, blood seems to be some sort of buffer substance in the ancient imagination that can exist in both the physical and spiritual realms. It's a gateway portal, in a way, that can make a physical place fit for a divine presence. What do I mean by that? I know that's kind of a weird way to word it. Well, I believe it's not that God wanted to kill all of the Egyptians. I don't think he did. I think it's that their abuse had gotten so bad that he had to step in. But if he appeared in Egypt, everyone would immediately die. Think about any time in the stories of the Bible where an angel appears to someone. Is it like any of the modern novels and biographies that people write about seeing an angel or anything? No, it's not some conversation that they have. It's always them falling flat on their face, freaking out, going, "Ah, I'm about to die." Like this is not supposed to happen. Why? Because angels are supernatural beings, and physical beings, natural beings, cannot exist on a supernatural realm without some sort of a buffer substance. We've talked about this a little bit before here, where it's kind of like having an astronaut up in space. You cannot exist in space. You are going to die really fast. But we have developed a buffer called a spacesuit where they can for a limited period of time. So it seems like in the ancient imagination, blood is the spacesuit that allows you to exist in space. And it's not even like space is purposefully trying to kill you. It is not antagonistic to you. It's just the nature of being in space that you will die because you don't belong there. And I think that's kind of the way it works with God, is like just by his very nature, because he is a supernatural spiritual being who is supposed to be all good, that if he comes into contact with humans, they cannot live in his presence. Think about like the Ark of the Covenant. I always like this example. There's a really weird story in, I believe it's 2 Samuel chapter 6, when the Israelites are trying to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to their land. I believe at that time it had been in the Philistines' land for a while. And one of the Israelites named Uzzah reached out to steady the ark when he saw that it was starting to fall off of the cart that they were carrying it on. And he was immediately struck dead when he touched the ark. And we look at that today and we go, what the heck happened? He was just trying to help. Why would God do that? Well, I think the idea is not so much that God punished him, but that the ark was a symbol of God's holy presence re-entering the land. And so it was just the physical reality that he entered outer space without a spacesuit on. And he just died of, if I can say, natural causes for being in an unnatural space. He was in a place where a physical body could not live. So kind of the opposite of that. Now we have a supernatural being, God, Yahweh, coming into Egypt, a place that has been completely corrupted by the mistreatment of these people, and God's mere presence there would be enough to turn everyone into the Nazis from the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But he tells them to put blood on the doorposts so that it will be a buffer that protects the house, makes it a safe place for the divine presence to be near. And verse 5 reads that this will not just affect the people who were in leadership here. In fact, it reads that this will happen from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill. Apparently, Umberto Cassuto had found some other Egyptian document that mentioned something about a slave girl behind the millstones. And so he saw that as perhaps being a just proverbial saying in Egypt at the time for the lowest of the low, according to Robert Alter. But this raises yet another uncomfortable question, because apparently that is just the kind of episode this is going to be. How do we handle God's willingness to kill innocent babies here? How is he any different from Pharaoh at the start of Exodus? And what about any Egyptians? I mean, Egypt was a pretty big land. What about Egyptians who didn't hear this message in time? And note too, and this is really weird for me, is that verse 5 ends by stating that this is not just for humans, even the firstborn of animals is threatened. And I think this kind of goes back to the little side tangent I just went on about blood and God's holiness coming into the land and natural humans not being able to exist in the presence of supernatural holiness. I think the ancient Near Eastern mindset would have been that the whole land had become corrupted by the actions of those living in it. So sometimes there's just this nuke it mindset of we need to just hit control alternate delete and restart, because it's not just the people who have done the evil, but it's almost like evil is this entity that can just seep in everywhere and affect everything, even if you are not directly involved in it. Now, let's try to talk a little bit about this firstborn issue. And I don't think that there's any way that we can make this not problematic, but I do think that we can at least understand it a little bit better. First, I'll say that there is no limit ever put on the age of the firstborn. So this does not seem to just be saying firstborn babies. Rather, it would be anyone who was the firstborn of the family. So like, I'm an only child, but I'm in my 20s, I would still be killed in this situation if I did not have blood on the doorpost. So you could potentially have, like, In my family, my father's also an only child, so we would both be gone. It's not like it's only one person per family. However, that being said, firstborn was not just an adjective in the ancient Near East, it was more so a status, and it referred very specifically to only males who were the firstborn son, not necessarily the firstborn child. So, like, if a family had 5 daughters and then a son, even though the son was the sixth child, he would be the firstborn in the family. That's just the way the ancient Near Eastern mindset worked. So I don't think in this case women are being threatened at all. I think it is entirely just the firstborn males. There is some debate to that, but that seems to be the direction the text is going in my mind, because even though it's not clearly stated one way or the other here, there is discussion in ensuing chapters about dedicating the firstborn son to Yahweh, which is its own weird mess because there's actually a command to kill the firstborn son, and then there's this whole thing about redeeming them with a sacrifice rather than killing them. That's a whole rabbit trail we don't have time to go into today, but it's a very strange passage that doesn't usually get preached in church because it's not exactly the warm fuzzies that we're used to. But my understanding of this is it will be the firstborn son of any family at any age. So that would mean if you were 80 and you were the firstborn son in your family, you would die. If it's a baby that was just born an hour ago and it's the firstborn son, they would die. So we have this broad age range, and it leads to the really uncomfortable question, like I brought up a minute ago, of how then is God any different if he is willing to kill innocent babies than the Pharaoh who killed innocent baby boys in the river Nile in chapter 1 and 2. I don't believe there is an easy answer to this. And personally, I think that if we try to jump to some easy answer, it does a disservice to the text. These texts are not meant to always make us feel comfortable. They're meant for us to wrestle with. And they're meant for us to push back on sometimes and say, this doesn't quite sit right with me. I think a lot of it really is just that ancient Near Eastern mindset of the whole land had become corrupted, so God is just nuking the whole thing and starting over. And in that mindset, you could say, well, rather than killing the entire family, he's actually being merciful just to kill one person. But that really sounds like mob boss logic. Like, I could kill your whole family, but really I'm just going to kill you instead. Like, there is no situation in which we would look at a person who does that and say, oh yeah, you're a good person for only killing one person instead of 6 in the whole family. Like, yeah, let me give you a pat on the back. Real moral of you. And if that's not okay for humans to do, I like to think that God is a better person than I am. So I think that it would also not be okay for God to do. So there's a lot of discomfort that this passage can bring when you start to think about it. And I'm not going to try to resolve that here. I'm just going to let us sit in the discomfort. And I would love to hear from you. Does that make you uncomfortable? Have you thought about that before? Have you heard any explanations of this before? I know it's so easy to fall back on the God's ways are higher than our ways and anything he does is good, so this must be okay. But again, if it's not okay for people to do, I don't think it's okay for God to do either, because he's better than we are. So his morality should not be less than ours. So we just have to let this text sit with us uncomfortably. When verse 7 says that not a dog will move his tongue, that is quite literally, no dog will sharpen its tongue. And Alter reminds us that dogs were not kept as pets in ancient Israel, so they have a consistently negative portrayal in biblical literature. So the idea of verse 7 is that even the meanest, most aggressive creature won't so much as growl in the direction of the Israelites as they leave. It's a promise of complete protection in the midst of this comprehensive judgment. When verse 8 reads, the people that follow you, it is literally the people at your feet. And when the verse ends that Moses left Pharaoh in a great anger, that is literally in a hot nose. That's a very distinct Hebraism for being angry. And you can imagine somebody, almost like a cartoon where they have steam coming out of their ears and their face turns bright red. That's the idea of having this hot nose, being angry in Hebrew. We've definitely seen a lot of sass out of Moses in the last chapter or two, but this is the first time he is actually described as being angry about what is going on. There's something deeply human about his anger here. I mean, after all, we were just reminded that the human Moses was great in the land of Egypt, so we get a very human emotion out of him. I'll remind you then, verse 9, the word wonder, it doesn't have to have a positive connotation, but it often does. So I think that's actually part of the intent of its being used here, is to be a little ironic, to show that God's working in our world is supposed to be a good thing, is supposed to be wondrous, but it can also be a terrifying thing if you're the one who's been mistreating people. God always acts on the behalf of the oppressed in Scripture. God just wants us to be decent humans to each other. So when he acts, it is the people who have been marginalized, who have been hurt, who are more likely to be on his good side. And it is the people who have either caused the abuse or who have enabled the abuse or who sometimes even have done nothing to stop the abuse, as we saw with the Egyptians here in this story. Those are the ones for whom God's wonders seem terrifying. Similar to previous discussions, hardened in verse 10 here, when Yahweh hardened the heart, is actually that word for strengthening. And I've brought this up when it has shown up in previous chapters, so I'm going to do it again here, that the word translated "so" here in the King James is not a great translation. It kind of drives me crazy, because it is implying intent that is not necessarily there. Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go. Conjunctions in Hebrew are very flexible, so it's not necessarily a purpose clause here, so that he wouldn't let Israel go. That makes it sound like God forced Pharaoh to behave badly so as to get punished. But the word can just as well, or I would argue better, be translated but. But he didn't let the children of Israel go. So rather than reading this as Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he wouldn't let the children of Israel go, rather we should read it, Yahweh strengthened Pharaoh's heart, but he still would not let the children of Israel go out of the land. Do you see the difference there? It is no longer making it sound like God forced Pharaoh to do this so that he wouldn't let the children of Israel go. Rather, it's saying that God gave him the strength to make a decision one way or the other, but he still would not let them go. Bias matters in translation. All right, that was chapter 11. We're going to get now through the first 11 verses of chapter 12. And I'm just going to be honest with you, that is a really awkward stopping point. But there are some big discussions that we need to have about verses 12 through 15 that I don't want to drag out this episode any longer with. I know it would make it too long. So verse 11 is not a great place to stop. It's kind of in the middle of the story, but it will allow us to not have a super long episode here and then a super short episode next week. So I'm just going to draw an arbitrary line right there. And this is going to be the last chapter that we cover in our Exodus series. I would love to keep going further with this, and hopefully in the future we will read some more in Exodus. But this series has taken up the majority of the year so far. So we still have some stuff that we have to talk through this year that is not Exodus related. So this Exodus series is going to stop here after chapter 12. We'll do this episode, one more next week on it, then we'll probably do a Q&R after that, and then we'll get into some other topics in the near future. Now, chapter 12 is the origin story for the Passover. And Jewish holidays were meant to give you a pause from the chaos of life. So it's actually built into the very narrative structure here that chapter 12 is a break from the story. And again, we're not going to get into chapter 13, so you're not going to feel the full effect of it. But I'd encourage you, read these chapters on your own, and you'll see how chapter 11 carries on the narrative. Chapter 12 is just all of these instructions that kind of feel out of place in the narrative. And then the narrative picks up again at the end of this chapter, moving into chapter 13. So I think that's purposefully built into the way that this chapter stands here, forcing you to take a pause from the story, because the instructions are about taking a pause from life to celebrate this day of freedom. It's purposefully meant to interrupt the normal rhythms of life, because we all get in a rut. We all get in cycles and just habits that we are used to how life works. And when you do that, you kind of stop seeing the beauty of life. And so sometimes we all need to take these special days where we just set aside time to live a different day than we would normally live, to interrupt our normal rhythms. That way we grow to appreciate the rhythms again when we go back to them. And notice how this declaration of freedom comes while they are still enslaved. God does not tell them all of this stuff once they are free. That becomes a key point of Paul's Christian theology several centuries later, that God's declaration comes while you are still a slave. He declares you to be free before the actual act of freeing even happens. So I really think Paul had this story in mind when he's writing out some of his letters to the churches later on. All right, let's go ahead and read these verses. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month will be to you the beginning of months. It will be the first month of the year to you. Speak you to all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month they will take to every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb will be without blemish, a male of the first year. You will take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you will keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will kill it in the evening. And they will take of the blood and strike it on the 2 side posts and on the upper doorpost of the houses, where they will eat it. And they will eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread. And with bitter herbs they will eat it. Don't eat it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. And you will let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remains of it until the morning you will burn with fire. Thus you will eat it with your loins girded, with your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand. You will eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover. All right, let's talk calendars for a minute here, because what else could possibly be more interesting? Well, believe it or not, I think you will actually find this fascinating. In verse 2 of chapter 12, God tells Moses that this month will be the beginning of months. It is the first month of the year to you. Well, if you happen to be familiar at all with the Jewish calendar, you might be scratching your head a little bit, because Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, is about 6 months away from Passover. So what's going on? It turns out that there are actually multiple Jewish New Years, each one serving a different purpose. Now, the language surrounding these is not necessarily New Year in the sense that we tend to think of it. And strangely enough, for all this talk of this month, this specific month is of such importance, we actually don't know which month this is aside from oral Torah. You will find several references to this month in this passage, and yet the text itself doesn't say what month that is. Later on, we realize that is the month Nisan. Now, since the Jewish calendar is built differently than our modern Gregorian calendar, the months are going to fall in between our months. So this is going to be usually in between March to April, is where Nisan will be. Later Midrashic tradition lays this out in far greater detail. This is Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 1. It reads, "There are 4 days in the year that serve as the new year, each for a different purpose. On the 1st of Nisan, that's what we're talking about here with Passover, is the new year for kings. It is from this date that the years of a king's rule are counted. On the 1st of Elul is the new year for animal tithes. All the animals born prior to that date belong in the previous tithe year and are tithed as a single unit, whereas those born after that date belong to the tithe for next year. On the 1st of Tishrei is the new year for counting years, as will be explained in the Gemara, for calculating sabbatical years and jubilee years. And on the 1st of Shevat is the new year for the tree. The fruit of the tree that was formed prior to that date belonged to the previous tithe year and cannot be tithed together with fruit that was formed after that date." So multiple quote-unquote New Years in Jewish calendars. You can almost kind of think of it how like the UK has an official day to celebrate the monarch's birthday that might not actually be their birthday. Or kind of like we have President's Day where we specifically celebrate Washington and Lincoln even though it is not their specific birthdays. So even though Rosh Hashanah is what we would think of as kind of corresponding to our Gregorian New Year, this Passover in Nisan is more of a liturgical New Year. Your calendar reveals your values. What you choose to mark as the beginning says a lot about what you think is most important. For Israel, liberation wasn't just a historical event, it was an organizing principle of time itself. And it seems like what may have happened with some of these different New Year dates is that there were probably different calendars in existence in ancient Israel at this time. I mean, people didn't have a systematized calendar system like we do today. And even today, depending on what part of the world you're in, you might have a different calendar system. So it's still not fully systematized around the world. So it seems like what we have here in the Passover, and we'll get into this before too long here, but sometimes we have it referred to as Passover, sometimes we have it referred to as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we'll also have mention of a dedication of the firstborn. So many scholars believe that Passover, unleavened bread, and the dedication of the firstborn were actually three separate festivities, if you will, coming from different parts of ancient Israel. And over time, they all converged into one particular day that can be called either Passover or Festival of Unleavened Bread. It's not usually referred to as a day of the firstborn, but that comes in later as well. Verse 3 has Moses speaking to the congregation of Israel, if you're using an older English version. And congregation is really only a word that we use in church context now, but the idea is people who congregate together. So I would not use that word now because it's more of a Christian term, but just think assembly when you see that. And notice how all of these things are said to all of Israel, even though they are the ones who are being freed. This whole operation was about freeing them. God takes time aside to make sure that they are all in on this, because there is value in having a ritualistic, performative side to religion. I came from a very low church background in the independent fundamental Baptist movement, where we rejected a liturgical calendar and really any rituals. Now, of course, we had our own traditions. We didn't like to admit that, but we had plenty of our own. But there is a rich history of liturgical seasons in the church that if you are not coming from more of a high church background, you may not be as familiar with. And they've been there for a long time, and they're there for a reason, because sometimes having that ritual, yes, there is a danger that it can become just habit in a sense where you don't think about it and it loses some of its intended meaning. Totally get that. But it's there for a reason. Having those rituals, that performative side to religion, places you in a story that is not originally yours so that you can better understand the narrative itself. And I think we see that here playing out in this text as God makes sure that every Israelite family is a part of this story. This is not just him enacting against the Egyptians, but rather he is drawing them into the narrative and making sure they are participating in this as well so it becomes personal to them. I think here we also see an echo of when God almost killed Moses on the eve of his next stage of life going back into Egypt. The Israelites are now about to enter into the next stage of their lives and were almost killed here as well, if not for the blood, just like a very bloody situation saved Moses going into Egypt several chapters back. Now, sometimes you will find people saying that sheep were sacred animals worshipped through Amun in ancient Egypt, and they then say that to kill one would have been highly offensive, if not even punishable by death, in Egypt. But everything I've been able to find so far has said that that is not accurate. I cannot find any serious scholarly source that says sheep were sacred animals in ancient Egypt. So if you can actually find a true scholarly source that says that, I would definitely change my notes here because that would be an important part of this story. But even though I've heard several people say it, I have not actually been able to track down any source that claims sheep were sacred in ancient Egypt. It seems to be the opposite. Now, I realize once we start getting into some sacrificial language here, it seems like a very foreign concept to us. And we don't even see our animals slaughtered that we eat every day on our table. Like, we are not used to the idea of butchering animals. That is just something that happens somewhere else. Whereas in the ancient world, the average person did not have meat on their table most days. It would have been much more of a vegetarian diet simply because they couldn't afford the meat. They didn't have it readily available, and when it was, you had to feast right then because you weren't able to keep it fresh. So it's a very different world than what we live in. And in his Exodus Old and New book, which I would definitely recommend if you're wanting to study Exodus in a more scholarly fashion. It is not an easy read all the time, but it's also not like ridiculously nerdy. It's kind of in between the two. Michael Morales, Exodus Old and New, really good book. So he kind of helps to get us thinking in the way that the ancient Israelites would have here. So this is a little bit of a lengthy quote, but I'm going to try to work through some of this here because I think it's helpful. He writes that blood manipulation would become a regular practice in the rituals of the later tabernacle for the sake of purification, with blood being applied to objects like the altar in order to cleanse them along with the worshiper. Consistent with this understanding of sacrificial ritual, the smearing or sprinkling of blood on door frames for the Passover would represent the purification of the household. The doorway stands for the house, and the house represents the household within it. Use of the hyssop branch for striking the lintel and doorposts with blood strengthens the interpretation of Passover as a cleansing ritual for the household, since hyssop is also commonly associated with ceremonial purification in the Pentateuch. The need for cleansing is expressed well in the psalm associated with David's repentance. Purge me with what? Hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. As a sign not only for the Israelites, but for Yahweh as well, who would see it and pass over the house, bringing no destruction on it. The lamb's blood was a central feature of the Passover ceremony. Not without reason, many have understood the blood to have an apotropaic function. That is, the blood served to ward off harm. The lamb's meat was sacrificial and, as such, holy. That the meat was to be burned, roasted in fire, and not cooked by boiling in water, accords with later sacrifices that would be burned on the fires of the altar of whole burnt offering. If I can just jump in real fast, what he is saying here is that later traditions for the Levitical priesthood are coloring the way that this story is told. So these things don't really matter here at the first Passover as they're leaving Egypt, but they will come to matter later on with the tabernacle and temple. So the Passover story is being told in kind of priestly terminology as if all those things from the tabernacle and temple are already happening, even though that's much later along in the timeline. Going back to Morales. The regulation for burning the portions that remain until morning also fits with later regulations for sacrifices, indicating that the meat was holy. Eating the sacrificial lamb's flesh, therefore, made those who ate it holy as well. The requirement that male participants be circumcised, along with later provisions for those who were unclean to celebrate Passover on the following month, underscore the sacredness of the meal. Since the household was consecrated, or made holy, by partaking of the sacred flesh, the Passover feast may be understood as a feast of consecration. More deeply, as the entire household would partake of the lamb's flesh, each member thereby identified with the firstborn son, who was himself represented by the sacrificial lamb. As the firstborn was spared destruction, so was the rest of the household, which was identified with the firstborn son. Ultimately, the entire Passover ceremony, along with the redemption it commemorates, had Israel's consecration unto Yahweh as its goal. End quote. All right, I realize that was a lot, but it's really important for us to grasp. Here's why. When was Jesus crucified? Passover. See, when we talk about Jesus' death and resurrection as Christians, there is so much language of atonement that gets thrown around. But the Day of Atonement was a totally separate part of the Jewish calendar. Passover is not the Day of Atonement. We have made the atonement such a central Christian doctrine when atonement is not the theme of the Passover, the very day that Jesus was killed. See, Passover is not about atonement. It is not about reuniting a sinful Israel with a holy God. That's what atonement would be. Passover is about consecration, aligning an already believing Israel with God's plan for them to live free of oppression. See, Jesus' death then takes on a whole different meaning. It's not just about atonement. It's not just about escaping hell, becoming one with God. Rather, it is about offering a new life and freedom from oppressive systems and people. It's about so much more than just that fire escape from hell that we think about with atonement. Rather, it is about consecration. If the main thrust of Jesus' death and resurrection was atonement, he would have been killed on the Day of Atonement. But rather, the way the story was told was very specifically constructed so that his death would happen at Passover. And Passover has a very different significance than the Day of Atonement. We're the ones who have gotten that confused. Once we get to verse 10, we're going to see that any leftovers have to be burned. So verse 4 gives us a more economical option for small families. Join up with another family to have fewer leftovers. In the very first action that Israel is to take as a nation, we find instructions for those who have more to share with those who have less. Chaim ibn Attar, a popular Moroccan Hasidic Jewish commentator from about 300-ish years ago, wrote that this implied God would make sure even the largest family would be able to get at least an olive-sized amount of lamb to each member of the family, since they were obeying a command of God. Now, that is certainly not in the text, and I kind of feel like you would have to have a really big family to only be getting an olive-sized piece of lamb to each one of them. I realize there's not a ton of meat on lamb. I've cooked it before, but I still feel like you should be getting a little more than an olive size. Either that or you got way too many siblings in that family. Regardless, note how this is a very corporate idea of salvation, of deliverance, where you only need one entity to represent each house. Again, as Christians, we have looked back on these scriptures and sometimes we have misunderstood and just kind of conglomerated them all together into one big mess when there's significance to each of these stories that we tend to miss because it's such a different culture from ours. We have such an individualistic idea of salvation where it's just about you personally being saved from your own personal sins and avoiding hell. But like we've talked about throughout the series, and I promise I'm not trying to be a heretic here, I'm just reading to you what is in the text. Exodus is the first time this idea of salvation comes up, and it is about physical deliverance from oppression. And it is very corporate. It is not just about individuals. Now, obviously, individuals were saved from Egypt here. They were delivered from the oppression of Pharaoh, but it was also done as a whole, and it was memorialized according to God's command here by families, by groups. We have let the rugged individualism of our modern culture shape our theology to the point that we've kind of twisted what salvation was originally about in Scripture. And it's not just about me personally. It's supposed to be something that spreads and that is communal. And I realize that sounds really weird to us as modern American Christians and bordering on heretical, but that's what's right here in this text. This is less about the individual salvation from sin that we would think about and more of a corporate, communal, economic solidarity together as a people. Verse 5 tells us that this lamb had to be, quote, without blemish. And that meant that you couldn't pick your worst looking sheep and sacrifice it. It had to meet certain criteria in order for this ritual to work. Now, these terms are new to us in the story. They may sound familiar now if you've read the Bible for a while or been in church for a while, but this is the first time these terms are showing up in the biblical story. They are going to show up a lot more in Leviticus. So kind of like we were talking about in the Morales quote, we have this language that is kind of foreign to this text. It's just plopped in there with no explanation because it's assumed that by the time that this text was written, people are already familiar with this because it has been going on in the land. I think a lot of us have the idea that these texts were being written exactly as they happened, but scholars will tell you that it's actually much later on that the stories were written. Now, they may have been told orally before that, but they're written down later, and that's why we have all of this later Levitical terminology being put here as a foreshadowing of what is to come later. In that word translated without blemish, it's tamim. It means whole. I kind of don't like the without blemish translation because whole is a positive thing. Without blemish is a negative thing. You see what I mean? If we just say it is whole, it is complete, it's perfect, if you will, that emphasizes the positive. If we say without blemish, it's emphasizing the negative, saying what it doesn't have. And the word has more of a positive connotation. And again, this idea of things or people being without blemish or whole will show up a lot through Leviticus especially. And today, it can sound kind of off-putting to us. The idea back then was that a deity only deserves the cream of the crop. But when that gets applied to people, it can be problematic, offensive, and I would even say anti-gospel. The idea back then was that only perfection can live in God's presence, kind of that thing we talked about earlier of like a buffer suit. When you have a perfect being come into an imperfect place, his perfectness takes over that, and we humans cannot exist in the place of that. So there's this whole idea of finding a way for all of Israel to be wearing spacesuits in space back then, if I can use my analogy, of being covered by this blood, this buffer substance. And so there were things that the ancients saw as preventing that from working. And that would be things that we would call disease or disorders or even disabilities. So at its core, it was about making sure that Israel would be a place where God could live with his people, even the ones who didn't reach that level of perfection individually. It would happen communally. But I think, especially by the time of Jesus, we start to see the negative side of this, where people are being excluded because they are not as pure as we think we are. And you know what? We still do that today. It's hurtful. It's wrong. People are no less people if they have blemishes, or if they don't match some subjective standard, even if we put that subjective standard in the mouth of God and claim that is what he wants. It was a very different world back then, and they were not thinking of the way that people with differences could feel when they are labeled by their differences. But the more time has gone on, we are learning to show the love of God to people the way that they want to be shown that love, and to hear from other perspectives, and to realize that everyone is the image of God, regardless of whether they fit our subjective understanding of what would be normal or having a body or mind without blemish. The lamb in this verse is described as being, quote, a male of the first year. Age in Hebrew is often expressed as being a child of X number of years. And that's what we have going on here. It's just a quirk of Hebrew language. A male of the first year is literally a male, a son of a year. So if you were, say, 25 years old, you would say that you are a child of 25 years. And did you catch the end of verse 5? This is something that I had never once heard before in church. It reads that the lamb will be without blemish, male of the first year. You will take it from the sheep or from the goats. For all this Christian talk of Jesus being the Passover lamb, I have never once heard anyone point out that God said the Passover could also be a kid, a goat. That kind of ruins the nice, clean imagery that Christians like, but it is right here in this verse. Verse 6 says that in the 14th day of the same month, the whole assembly will rise up and kill their lamb in the evenings. I just want you to try to enter into that story for a second and imagine the sounds, the smells, the mess of this mass slaughter happening all at the same time. And you may have caught there's a little bit of a time difference here in these verses, because verse 3 said that you would pick it out in the 10th day of the month, but here in verse 6 we see that you will keep it until the 14th day of the month. And there is all kinds of debate over why this Passover lamb or kid was to be kept for 4 days. There's even debate in Jewish tradition for why 4 days. No one really knows for sure. Our best guess seems to be that it was to give time to inspect everything, to get it ready, to make sure that the lamb didn't have any blemishes. That's certainly the reasoning that became primary over time. But that still doesn't really explain why 4 days instead of any other number. Maybe it was just to make sure that everyone in the land had time to hear these instructions before everything happened. Make sure the message got out in enough time and to be able to gather a lamb and get everything together. I'm not 100% sure. The text doesn't specify, and commentators have been divided on this. So if you have any thoughts on why this 4-day gap, I would love to hear from you. You can always write in on our website, on the homepage. You can email cconn@thebibleuncut.com, comment on our socials, hop on Discord, whatever you'd like. Give us your thoughts on why this 4-day break in between verses 3 and 6, in between the setting aside of the lamb and the slaughtering of the lamb. And not just like, oh yeah, it was to hold on to it and inspect it. Okay, well, you could do that in 1 day. So why 4 specifically? Love to hear your thoughts. Note also the doubled language at the end of verse 6 here, the whole assembly of the congregation. Assembly and congregation mean the same thing. So what is an assembly of a congregation? I just think it's kind of a quirk of Hebrew language there. As we move into verse 7 and we start talking about applying the blood to the door, we see where you're going to take the blood with hyssop, and we don't know exactly what this hyssop was there. It's probably not the plant that we think of as hyssop today, or we're really not sure exactly what it would be, but some sort of reed kind of plant. And then they're to put blood on either doorpost and on the lintel. Not lentil, lintel, Lintel. That is the big beam right above the door. This continues a theme that Bible Project has been really good at pointing out in recent years of sacrifice happening at the door. We see this with the first Cain and Abel story, where the implication seems to be that they may have actually sacrificed right at the door of the garden. And we see this with Noah as well, where he sacrifices at the door of the ark. And then we eventually have this happen in the tabernacle and temple as well. And here we have a sacrifice taking place right at the door of these houses. Now, the Tanakh has 5 main sacrifices. And again, this comes across as really foreign to us, and it all kind of just amalgamates into one big conglomeration that's really confusing. So let's see if we can make some better sense of this so we're not so confused. 5 main types of sacrifices in the Tanakh: burnt, grain, peace, sin, and trespass. And despite what so many Christians think, most of these sacrifices had nothing to do with sin, atonement, or getting right with God. The first 3, burnt, grain, and peace, 60%, over half of the sacrifices described, were not related to sin at all. They were thanksgiving, free will offerings, sacrifices made to Yahweh just because you're thankful for something he did for you. And even the ones related to sin could be substituted with flour if the family was too poor for an animal. So much for our Christian idea that these sacrifices required blood. Blood, atonement, and substitution, they were all legitimate aspects of the sacrificial system, but they were not the entirety of the system like we tend to think. We often see those as being the main thing about the Jewish sacrificial system, when really they were just a fraction of what the sacrifices were all about. And in fact, this is the first time in Scripture that God has required a sacrifice in order for someone to live. Up until now, only 2 sacrifices have been commanded by God, and neither have had a specified penalty if not performed. In the garden, God clothed Adam and Eve in some sort of skin. We're not actually told that he killed an animal, much less a lamb. So if you ever heard that in church, that is inaccurate. The text never says that. You can read Genesis 3 from start to finish as many times as you want. It does not say that God killed an animal, nor does it say that the animal was a lamb. We're just told that he clothed them in skins, whatever that may mean. In Genesis 4, Cain and Abel offer a sacrifice, but there is no indication that was for sin. If anything, it actually more closely matches the thanksgiving just because offerings from Leviticus. That becomes really interesting because vegetables were an accepted offering in Thanksgiving offerings. So that removes our standard belief for why Cain's offering was rejected. I go into that more in our episode on Genesis 4. In Genesis 8, Noah sacrifices animals in thanksgiving for surviving the flood. In Genesis 15, God told Abraham to make a sacrifice, but that was in order to establish a covenant, so that's kind of a separate thing. In Genesis 22, God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. At the end of Genesis 31, Jacob sacrifices in order to form a covenant with Laban. He then makes a sacrifice in Genesis 35 as well after his fight with the angel, and that as well seems to be covenant related. And then in Genesis 46, he makes Thanksgiving sacrifice. So the lamb here is a stand-in for the firstborn, who is a stand-in for the entire house. God was saying that the abuse of Egypt had gotten so great that he needed to pull a flood moment again, where he wiped out all the living creatures in the land. He was going on a divine purge and hitting Control-Alternate-Delete on Egypt. But whereas Pharaoh did not give an alternate option to being enslaved and abused, Yahweh offered a way out, much like with the ark and the flood. The way out was to kill the future leader of the family, to cut off the family at the knees. But that hardly seems like a good option. So he also gave the option of killing an innocent animal in place of the firstborn and smearing the fresh blood over the entrance of your house. It was meant to be a very graphic portrayal of the violence that the Egyptians had enacted on the Israelites. The Israelites did it as a reminder of what they had been through and the freedom that was to come. Now, that being said, you do kind of have to ask the question here, why did God go through all of this theatrics in the first place? It kind of feels like he's playing by rules, trying to game a system, when we would think if he's really the ultimate God, he makes the rules, why not just change the rules to just kill Pharaoh, or just Pharaoh's firstborn, or the firstborn of all the people who actively abused Israel, or just the people who actually did the abusing instead of including innocents in there? Why include Israel at all in this operation when the whole thing was for the sake of freeing them? I don't have perfect answers for it, and that's okay. We can come up with these nice theological answers that check all the boxes and sound good on paper, but at the end of the day, you do still have to wrestle with why God chose to do it this way. And I think going back to our earlier conversation, it's about getting the people to identify very personally with this ritual so that they are reminded of where they came from, and so that hopefully the goal would be for them not to make the same mistakes in the future. Now, spoiler alert, they do. But that's just humanity for you. And these instructions we start getting into in verse 8 are not very meaningful at this point. They feel a little out of place. But again, they're foreshadowing the Levitical codes that you'll read about in the next couple books of the Torah. And some of the original meanings of these instructions are lost to time, but there are some aspects that we can surmise. For example, the unleavened bread not having leaven in the bread was so that you would not have to wait for the dough to rise before putting it in the oven. They were going to have to leave quickly, so they needed food that they could prepare quickly. Verse 9 tells them not to eat of it raw, nor sodden at all with water. And that word sodden, it is bashal in Hebrew. It means to boil something. Alter has this to say about the injunction on not eating raw meat. He says that it would have been prohibited anyway, but elsewhere there is no restriction on boiled meat. Here that would be lamb stew, whether for sacrificial or profane purposes. William H. Propp offers what may be the best explanation for this insistence on fire roasting, by observing that was a more archaic method of cooking meat, without the use of a pot, cooking utensils being the instruments of a more complex culinary technology. In this fashion, he goes on to suggest, fire roasting would be associated with a kind of purity in the preparation of the meal, just as flatbread, probably baked over an open fire nomad style, without any admixture of leaven, might be associated with purity. One could add that these archaically prepared foods enhance the sense of ritual reenactment of what amounts to an archaic moment of national history, when the nation itself was awaiting its foundational liberty as a destroying angel stalked through the Egyptian night and passed over the houses of the Israelites. End quote. In other words, the harder and more hands-on a task is, the more it reminds us of our dependence on entities outside of ourselves. It would kind of be like reenacting making a meal from revolutionary times here in America. It would be very awkward. It would take us out of our normal rhythms and remind us of what life would have been like back then. That's the point of having the Israelites, even later on, continue to make the Passover in this same way. And verse 9 says that you are to eat the whole thing, head with legs, and the purtenance thereof. Purtenance is a lovely King James era word that meant innards or entrails. They were supposed to eat the liver, the heart, the gizzard, everything. Verse 10 is where we get the command to burn any leftovers with fire. I could be wrong here, but I see some symbolism in leaving their old life completely behind. Symbols are powerful, and this burning of the remains of such a significant meal would have likely reminded them that they had nothing to go back to in Egypt. It's kind of like our phrase, burn the ships. It's a reminder that there is nothing left for you in your past. Focus on the present and the future, because that is all that is ahead. At least, I think that's what the intent was supposed to be. But if that was the goal, it was not very successful, since just a little further along in the story, the Hebrews are going to say that they should just return to Egypt. So apparently it didn't have the desired effect. Verse 11 tells them to eat this with your loins girded. And to gird up your loins was to wrap up the front of your robe into your belt so that you could move more freely. Any women listening to this who have ever had to wear a dress or skirt will appreciate the hindered motion that certain outfits can have that maybe some of the men here have not had as much experience with. So in an ancient world where pretty much everyone is wearing a robe of some sort, you would then wrap up the front of it into the belt so that you had a better range of motion where you weren't hindered by your clothing. So all of these seemingly odd instructions are ways of telling the Israelites that they had to be ready to go at a moment's notice. They were eating the original fast food. Okay, we have one more super cool bit of nerdiness that we have to get into here before we close out for the day. And I think you are going to love this as much as I do. At least I hope so. Because it's this little detail that is tucked into verse 9 that you're probably never going to hear preached. But it is a great example of how the biblical authors wanted us to read Scripture. So this is going to set an example for us of how the Bible is meant to be read. All right? Now that I've given you that teaser, let's look at verse 9 one more time. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden, nor boiled at all with water, but roast with fire. All right, so we're going to focus just on that little bit here. Don't boil it at all with water, rather roast it with fire. The word for boil in Hebrew is bashal. The word for roast is tsali. So don't you dare bashal it, you are to tsali it. Okay? Easy enough. Very clear. But in Deuteronomy 16:7, When Moses is summarizing the Torah for a new generation, he commands them to bashal the Passover. What was the one rule that I just told you they were to have here? Do not bashal it. Saleh it. But 3 books later, Deuteronomy 16, Moses tells them, bashal the Passover. Now, if you're scratching your head and you're going to double check me on this, most English translations will just turn bashal, the boil word, into roast in Deuteronomy. So they actually change the meaning of the word in order to make the passages cohere. They change the underlying Hebrew text in order to smooth over what they see as an inconsistency. See, the translators were worried about this contradiction far more than the authors were. The authors seemed totally okay with the law being one thing for one generation and another thing for a next. Because the biblical instructions, the biblical law, the Torah, it is not about setting up God's ideal for all time. It's an example. It's a case study in how to live in a way pleasing to Yahweh. See, not boiling it was really important here in Exodus because they didn't have the time to do all that. And like we brought in from some of Alter's thoughts, it may have been about having a more primitive form of cooking as well to add to the theatrics of it. But once they're in the land, they have a little more time. They are able to boil it. That's okay. And all this becomes both more convoluted and clearer once we add in one more verse to the mix. That's 2 Chronicles 35:13. I told you this was not getting preached on in your church this week, right? No one is going to 2 Chronicles 35:13. And if they are, I definitely need to hear about it. I want to know what church you're going to. All right, 2 Chronicles 35:13 is when King Josiah makes a Passover. It's the first time that they've celebrated a Passover in the land in a while. And he boils it, right? But if you look closely at the verse, it says that he bashals it with fire. In Exodus here, it says, don't bashal it, saleh it with fire, roast it with fire. He doesn't saleh it with fire, he bashals it with fire, he boils it with fire. You don't boil with fire, you boil with liquid, you roast in fire. So what's going on here? King Josiah combined the two passages. He combined Exodus 12 and Deuteronomy 16. He said, okay, one of them says, don't you dare bashal it, you should saleh it, don't boil it, roast it with fire. And the other says, you should bashal it. So what do? Well, how about I bashal it in fire? How about I find a way to boil it in fire? Now, how exactly he did that, I don't know. Maybe he pan-seared it and then boiled it the rest of the way. Maybe he broiled it. Maybe he created some new cooking method. We don't know. That is not the point. The point is how he handled the text. He becomes the ultimate Torah observant king because he finds a way to bring both of these passages together. It's kind of like that scene in Cobra Kai and plenty of similar scenes in movies and TV shows where there's a potted plant on top of a pole and the sensei says to kick the plant off the pole. Everyone tries to jump high enough and no one can actually reach it. And then the one kid just comes along and kicks the whole pole over, knocking over the plant in the process. That's what Josiah is doing. He is creating a D, all of the above, for the multiple choice, coloring outside of the lines in order to make the picture all that it could be. Now, complete disclosure, just to be fully honest with you, there seems to be some variety in what exactly bashal can mean over time, because there is a verse later on in scripture that talks about bashaling in a sense of baking, like baking bread. And obviously you don't boil bread. So there is some nuance to it. But I think the point here in these verses, and when we bring this all together, when we do this biblical theology of saying, these seem to contradict what's going on, is to say that God's instructions are the best that they can be for that particular time. But that doesn't mean they are the once for all, this is the way it is always supposed to be. Within the sacred scriptures themselves, we find a difference in how to follow these commands, even in a way that directly contradicts the older command. And the best way I can explain this is with parenting a child. When you have a really small child, you might tell them, don't cross the street without mommy or daddy. But by the time they're a teenager and they're getting ready to leave the house, they're 18, college age, whatever, if they still think they can't cross the street without mommy or daddy, there's a problem. The law needs to change. That doesn't mean that the original law was bad. It's about the heart behind it. Sometimes, in order to maintain the heart behind an instruction, we have to break the letter of the instruction itself. The heart behind the instruction, don't cross the street, was to keep the kids safe, to allow them to develop. Well, by the time they're a teenager, they better be able to cross the street on their own. If they can't, you are no longer maintaining the heart behind the instruction, which was to keep them safe, to allow them to thrive. They need to be able to cross the street to be able to thrive as an adult. And they need to be able to do it on their own. So in order to follow the heart behind the original law, you actually have to break that law. And that's the way the Bible works too. And I know some of you are really uncomfortable with that idea and you think I'm a heretic for saying that. But again, I just want to point you back to these verses where within our own sacred scripture, we have a verse that says, don't do X. And then 3 books later, it says, be sure to do X. And then several books later, we find somebody who notices this difference and goes, how about I do Z? And he just finds a way to make both of them work. And I think that's what we're supposed to do with Scripture, is we're supposed to say, not just what is the exact letter of this, not to get caught up in the minutia of the debates that Christians can so often lose their way in, but rather to say, what was the original heart behind this? What does God actually want me to take from this? What is the principle here? Because we live several thousand years and half a world away from this. Sometimes the letter of the law is just not going to apply to us anymore. But maybe we can find a way for the principle to. That's the way that God wants us to interpret Scripture, according to Scripture. All right, if I have not scared all of you away by now, thank you for coming along with us on this journey through Exodus 11 and the first part of chapter 12 here. There was so much ground that we covered, and a lot of controversies. And it can seem really weird talking about a 3,000-year-old story that deals with plagues and unleavened bread and trying to find some way for it to speak into our contemporary moment. But I believe it does. I think, firstly, it challenges our role as bystanders. The Egyptian neighbors who saw daily abuse and did nothing were held accountable just as much as the people who enacted the abuse. And that should make us uncomfortable about the ways that we remain silent in the face of injustices all around us. Second, it reminds us that liberation is more than just legal freedom. Those Egyptian neighbors were required by God to provide resources for the Israelites' future success. Freedom alone isn't enough. People need to be set up to thrive. Third, it shows us that God's calendar isn't our calendar. His time is not always our time. Israel was told to mark time differently, to organize their year around the memory of liberation rather than agricultural cycles or political events. What we choose to commemorate reveals what we value. And finally, it reminds us that sometimes the most sacred moments happen during the most disruptive times. The Passover instructions interrupt the narrative of the story, just as the observance itself was meant to interrupt normal life. Sometimes we encounter the divine not in the calm, orderly moments that we would like to, but actually in the midst of upheaval and change. And lastly, the word wonder isn't always positive. God's intervention in our world should be wonderful. It should be full of wonder. But if you find yourself on the wrong side of justice, if you have been complicit in systems that harm others, that wonder might feel more like terror. See, the question isn't whether God acts in history. The question is, when he does, which side of the story will you be on? Next week, we are wrapping up chapter 12 and the main body of our Exodus series. And we still have so much to talk about. We will be discussing Egyptian gods, evil angels, ancient Egyptian stories of deaths of the firstborn children, and what it means for God to bless Pharaoh. All that and so much more next week. So until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.